found us! Open fire! Get down! Take cover!
The night air over the Pacific jungle is heavy and wet. It clings to skin and uniforms alike. Somewhere beyond the tree line, insects buzz in a constant, grinding chorus. It is past midnight. The moon is hidden behind thick cloud. 4 Japanese infantrymen crouched in shallow foxholes. This darkness is familiar, comforting even. Night has always been their ally. They wait in silence, rifles held close, bayonets fixed. Orders were clear. Move after dark, close with the enemy, strike before armor can react. This is how they have survived American firepower. This is how they have fought since China. Then the jungle changes. A low mechanical rumble rises from the darkness ahead. Not gunfire, not artillery, something heavier, slower. Suddenly, the night is torn open. A blinding white beam erupts from the darkness, sweeping across trees, earthworks, and human figures frozen in place. Another light snaps on, then another. Shadows vanish. Concealment dies instantly. Steel silhouettes emerge behind the light. Tanks advancing deliberately. Engines steady, guns already aligned. For the first time, the night no longer belongs to the men hiding in it. And in that moment, fear takes hold, not of fire, but of being seen. For the Imperial Japanese Army, darkness was not merely a condition of battle. It was doctrine. Long before the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, Japanese infantry units had trained to fight at night as a matter of routine. In China during the 1930s, night movement had allowed lightly equipped troops to bypass stronger positions, infiltrate rear areas, and strike where firepower was weakest. Silence, concealment, and surprise became institutional habits rather than situational choices. When war expanded across the Pacific, those habits traveled with the infantry. Japanese doctrine emphasized the idea that night erased technological imbalance. American forces possessed heavier artillery, radios, aircraft, and armor. Japanese forces possessed discipline, endurance, and the ability to move unseen. Darkness reduced American advantages to sound and instinct. In jungle terrain, where sight lines were already short, night amplified that advantage even further. The early months of the Pacific War reinforced this belief. On Guadalcanal in 1942, Japanese night attacks repeatedly caught U.S. Marines off balance. Units trained for daylight maneuver suddenly found themselves surrounded in pitch-black jungle, listening for whispers and footfalls they could not locate. Artillery was difficult to coordinate. Tanks, when present at all, were blind beyond a few meters. For Japanese infantrymen, the lesson seemed proven. If the sun set, the battlefield became theirs. But the Pacific was not a static environment. The very terrain that favored infiltration also forced adaptation. The islands were thick with vegetation, coconut groves, Kenai grass, mangrove swamps, volcanic ridges. Visibility rarely extended more than 50 meters even during daylight. At night, it collapsed almost entirely. American patrols moved cautiously, often halting altogether after dark. Commanders worried less about advance than survival. Japanese units exploited this rhythm. They probed perimeters at night, testing wire, listening for careless movement. Small groups slipped through gaps and struck command posts or supply dumps. Others waited until exhaustion set in, then attacked suddenly and at close range, where numerical strength mattered less than resolve. Yet as the war dragged into 1943 and 1944, the balance slowly began to shift. American forces learned, not quickly but relentlessly. Defensive perimeters improved. Trip flares and early warning systems appeared. Machine gun, interlocking fields of fire were planned specifically for darkness. But offense remained a problem. The question facing Allied commanders was simple and unresolved. How do you move forward at night without becoming blind? armor presented the sharpest contradiction. Tanks were powerful, but poorly suited to jungle warfare. Their size made concealment impossible. Their vision ports were narrow. Infantry feared moving too close to them after dark. For much of the war, tanks were parked or withdrawn entirely at night, treated as daylight tools only. That hesitation allowed Japanese infantry to keep their advantage, until the idea emerged that darkness itself could be challenged, not with more guns, but with light. The concept was unsettling. Light attracted attention. It exposed positions. It seemed to violate every instinct drilled into soldiers since the beginning of warfare. Yet engineers and commanders alike began asking whether controlled illumination, mounted, armored, and mobile, could turn night into something usable rather than feared. At first, it sounded impractical. It began appearing on the battlefield. And once it did, night fighting in the Pacific would never feel the same again. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered a new phase. The frantic improvisation of the early years was giving way to methodical pressure. Island by island, Allied forces were advancing westward, supported by overwhelming industrial output. With every landing, American commanders arrived better equipped, better supplied, and more willing to experiment. Night, once something to be endured, became something to be studied. In Europe, British engineers had already explored the idea of artificial illumination on the battlefield. The most notable result was the Canal Defense Light, a powerful carbon arc searchlight mounted inside a tank turret. Its beam projected through a narrow vertical slit. The intention was to illuminate enemy positions while blinding defenders, all while protecting the light source behind armor. Though the CDL saw limited combat use in Europe, the concept itself was known to Allied planners. In the Pacific, conditions were different, but the problem was the same. American tanks operating against Japanese infantry faced a unique threat at night. Japanese soldiers were trained to close with armor, crawl underneath it, attach explosive charges, or attack vision slits at point-blank range. Darkness allowed these tactics to flourish. Every tank crew knew the sound of footsteps near their hull meant danger they might never see. Searchlights, once considered liabilities, began to be reconsidered as shields rather than beacons. Mounted on tanks or supporting vehicles, they offered something infantry could not: controlled directional illumination that moved with the advance. This was not a sudden doctrinal shift announced from Washington. It happened quietly in the field. Tank crews experimented with fixed headlights, turret-mounted lamps, and improvised shields to reduce glare. Infantry learned to advance just outside the edge of the beam, using the light to expose the enemy while remaining partially concealed themselves. Engineers added sandbags and welded plates to protect vulnerable equipment. The goal was not to turn night into day. It was to fracture the enemy's sense of invisibility. When a searchlight cut through jungle darkness, it did more than reveal terrain. It erased the psychological refuge Japanese infantry relied upon. Movement that once felt safe suddenly felt reckless. Every step risked instant exposure. Shadows became traps rather than cover. Reports from the field began to note the effect. Japanese soldiers caught in illumination froze, scattered, or fired blindly. Units attempting night infiltration found themselves silhouetted against light-washed foliage. Even disciplined troops struggled to advance when they could see themselves being seen. Importantly, these lights were rarely used alone. They were coordinated with machine guns, artillery, and infantry movement. Light fixed the enemy in place. Fire finished the work. By the time American forces reached the Philippines and later Okinawa, night operations had evolved into something deliberate and aggressive. Tanks no longer withdrew after sunset by default. Instead, some units pushed forward under controlled illumination, daring Japanese infantry to abandon the darkness they depended on. This shift did not eliminate risk. Searchlights drew fire. Tank crews became targets. But commanders increasingly judged the trade acceptable. The advantage gained, clarity, initiative, psychological dominance, outweighed the danger. For Japanese infantrymen, this was deeply unsettling. The battlefield had rules they understood. Darkness was one of them, and now the enemy was breaking it. That fracture between expectation and reality will be felt most sharply not in strategy rooms, but in the moment when light suddenly flooded a position meant to remain unseen. It is there at ground level that the story turns. For the Japanese infantrymen, night was not merely tactical. It was personal. Many had marched for years under the assumption that darkness belonged to them. Training reinforced it. Experience confirmed it. In the jungle, they moved by sound, memory, and instinct. Faces were unseen. Fear was manageable because it was shared by the enemy. Searchlights shattered that balance. When illumination swept across a position, it exposed more than bodies. It revealed isolation. A soldier who believed himself hidden suddenly stood alone in open ground, every movement visible. Accounts describe men instinctively dropping flat, pressing themselves into earth that no longer offered concealment. Others froze, unsure whether movement or stillness carried greater risk. This reaction was not cowardice. It was shock. Darkness had always allowed Japanese infantry to choose the moment of contact. Light reversed that control. The initiative, so central to Japanese doctrine, slipped away in seconds. From a tactical perspective, searchlights redefined engagement distance at night. Japanese night attacks relied on closing to within grenade or bayonet range before detection. Illumination pushed that moment outward, often by dozens of meters. Once exposed, infantry formations lost cohesion. Hand signals were useless. Whispered commands were swallowed by engine noise. Leaders struggled to regroup units that could now be tracked visually by machine gunners and tank crews. Light did not kill on its own, but it made killing easier. The technology itself was deceptively simple. These were not futuristic devices, but powerful lamps adapted to armored platforms. Their strength lay in integration. Mounted behind armor, linked to movement and firepower, searchlights became tools of dominance rather than vulnerability. Crucially, they moved. Unlike flares, they did not fade. Unlike fixed lights, they could advance. This mobility allowed American forces to control where fear traveled. The beams swept, paused, then shifted again, forcing Japanese infantry to react continuously, never settling into the rhythm night once provided. Each of these angles fed into the next. Human shock enabled tactical collapse. Tactical collapse validated technological risk, and together, they pushed commanders to expand the practice. That expansion would soon raise deeper questions, not just about how to fight at night, but how leadership and morale bent under illumination. For American commanders, the decision to use searchlights at night was never taken lightly. Field reports emphasized both their value and their danger. A lit tank became a focal point for enemy fire. Commanders understood that illumination demanded discipline, tight coordination between armor, infantry, and supporting weapons. Yet leadership increasingly saw light as a force multiplier. Units that advanced under controlled illumination reported fewer close-range surprises. Tank crews felt less blind. Infantry moved with greater confidence, knowing what lay ahead of them was visible, if only for moments at a time. Leadership at the battalion and regimental level adapted quickly. Orders emphasized restraint. Lights were switched on suddenly, held briefly, then redirected. The aim was disorientation rather than constant exposure. Used this way, searchlights became instruments of tempo, dictating when the enemy reacted rather than responding to him. Japanese after-action reports and prisoner interrogations began reflecting confusion and frustration. Soldiers described being caught in white fire or frozen by sudden brightness. Night infiltration plans failed, not because of increased American numbers, but because concealment could no longer be assumed. The psychological strain compounded exhaustion. Night, once a period of movement and initiative, became a time of anxiety. Infantry units hesitated. Leaders delayed attacks, fearing exposure before reaching effective range. In some cases, Japanese units attempted to counter the lights directly, firing blindly at beams or launching desperate assaults toward the source. These reactions often resulted in heavy casualties, reinforcing the sense that something fundamental had changed. Light carried moral weight. Being seen meant being judged, targeted, and reduced from warrior to silhouette. For soldiers trained to value stealth and sacrifice, exposure stripped away the meaning of their tactics. This erosion of confidence did not happen instantly. It built over nights of failed approaches and shattered expectations. Darkness no longer promised safety. It offered uncertainty instead. By the time major battles reached their most violent phases, illumination had become more than a tool. It was a message. The enemy would not wait for daylight. The battlefield belonged to whoever controlled perception. All of these angles converged on a single truth. Once night lost its protective power, engagements escalated faster and ended more decisively. That convergence would soon reach its breaking point in a series of night actions where searchlights were no longer experiments, but integral to the assault itself. The turning point arrived not with a single invention, but with a moment of acceptance. Night could be fought through if it could be controlled. By the spring of 1945, during the grinding campaign for Okinawa, American forces were no longer experimenting. They were committing. The island's southern ridges were a maze of caves, trenches, and reverse-slope defenses designed to disappear after sunset. Japanese infantry used night to reposition, reinforce, and strike supply lines. American commanders responded by refusing to surrender the hours of darkness. On selected nights, armored units moved forward deliberately. Engines idled low. Infantry followed close, spreading out on the edges of visibility. Then, without warning, searchlights ignited. The effect was immediate and violent. Beams cut across escarpments and ravines, spilling into cave mouths and trench lines. Vegetation that once swallowed movement now reflected light sharply, turning concealment into contrast. Japanese soldiers attempting to reposition were caught mid-stride, outlines stark against illuminated ground. Machine guns opened fire the moment figures appeared. Tank guns followed, blasting suspected positions already fixed by light. Artillery observers, now able to see reference points, adjusted fire with rare nighttime precision. Japanese counterattacks collapsed before they formed. Units advancing under cover of darkness found themselves exposed far too early. Attempts to rush the lights ended in devastating losses, as attacking infantry crossed open ground under sustained fire. The psychological rupture was unmistakable. Survivors described the sensation of being hunted rather than hunting. Darkness, once protective, now betrayed them. For American forces, confidence surged. Tank crews reported fewer close-range threats. Infantry moved faster, less hesitant. The battlefield no longer paused at sunset. This was the moment night fighting changed. Not because searchlights were perfect, but because they worked well enough to shift initiative permanently. Yet the night was not finished resisting. Japanese forces adapted desperately, throwing everything they had into one last attempt to reclaim the darkness. The confrontation was not over. It was tightening. The Japanese response was immediate, improvised, and costly. If darkness could no longer conceal movement, then speed and sacrifice would have to replace it. Infantry units were ordered to attack the source of the light directly. Small groups advanced low and fast, firing toward the beam even when they could not see the tank behind it. Others waited until illumination shifted, then attempted to slip through newly formed shadows. These efforts demanded extraordinary courage, but they faced a battlefield that had already changed. Searchlights did not stand alone. They were synchronized. As a beam fixed a sector, machine guns swept its edges. Mortars dropped shells onto escape routes revealed seconds earlier. Tanks adjusted their hulls deliberately, rotating light and gun together, forcing attackers to remain exposed longer than doctrine allowed. In several documented night engagements, Japanese infantry assaults stalled before reaching effective grenade range. Casualties mounted rapidly. Leaders struggled to issue commands in conditions where visual concealment no longer existed, but auditory chaos intensified. The loss was not only physical, it was doctrinal. Night infiltration, the cornerstone of Japanese infantry tactics, could no longer be trusted. Units hesitated to move without absolute darkness. Some chose to remain static, ceding initiative entirely. Others attacked anyway, suffering losses that yielded no tactical gain. American after-action reports reflect a shift in language. Where night once meant holding or defensive posture, it now included terms like advance, pressure, and clearance. Tanks, once parked until dawn, became instruments of persistence. The decisive change was psychological control. Searchlights dictated tempo. They forced reactions. They collapsed uncertainty on one side while spreading it on the other. By the time these engagements ended, the result was unmistakable. Japanese infantry could still fight at night, but they could no longer rely on it. Darkness had been neutralized as a sanctuary. The battlefield fell quiet again, not because fear had vanished, but because one side now understood the terrain of night better than the other. What followed was not immediate collapse, but a steady erosion of confidence, of tactics, and a belief in the old rules of war. That erosion would shape the final phase of the campaign and the war itself. When daylight returned, the ground told a quiet story. Spent cartridges lay scattered across illuminated paths that had once been hidden. Bodies rested where concealment had failed. Shallow trenches, carefully prepared for night use, were now exposed as ineffective shelters against a battlefield that refused to sleep. 4 Japanese infantry units. The immediate aftermath was confusion and exhaustion. Losses sustained during failed night movements were difficult to replace. Officers reported growing reluctance among troops to conduct traditional infiltration after dark, not because the training had disappeared, but because its reliability had. The psychological cost was severe. Night operations required confidence above all else. Confidence that darkness would hide movement, mask numbers, and protect intent. Once that confidence fractured, hesitation crept in. Units delayed attacks. Movements were postponed until conditions felt safe, a judgment that became increasingly rare. American forces, by contrast, recorded a measurable change in tempo. Positions that once had to be approached cautiously at dawn were now pressured continuously. Tanks and infantry advanced incrementally through the night, using illumination sparingly but decisively. This denied Japanese defenders the ability to regroup, resupply, or reposition under cover of darkness. Casualty reports reflected this imbalance. While searchlights themselves did not cause losses directly, their use correlated with fewer close-range ambushes against armor and infantry. Tank crews reported fewer explosive attacks against hulls. Infantry patrols encountered fewer sudden contacts. Importantly, this was not universal across the Pacific. Searchlights were tools, not miracles. Terrain, weather, and unit discipline still dictated outcomes. But where illumination was used effectively, Japanese night advantages narrowed sharply. Japanese commanders attempted adaptation. Some units shifted attacks to dawn or twilight. Others increased reliance on fixed defenses and tunnel networks, abandoning aggressive night movement altogether. These changes slowed operations and reduced flexibility, luxuries the Imperial Japanese Army could no longer afford in 1945. What emerged was a battlefield rhythm fundamentally altered. Night no longer reset the fight. It extended it. That extension carried consequences beyond the immediate tactical sphere. It affected morale, logistics, and the broader strategic balance as the war approached its end. Those broader effects would soon become impossible to ignore. As the campaign ground on, the effects of illuminated night warfare rippled outward. What began as a tactical adaptation evolved into a quiet transformation of operational thinking. American units learned that pressure, when applied without pause, eroded resistance faster than any single assault. Night illumination allowed advances to continue when defenders expected relief. Japanese units that relied on darkness to reorganize found themselves trapped in a state of constant alert, their energy drained by unending vigilance. Logistics suffered. Movement of supplies after dark became hazardous. Runners and carrying parties, once invisible, were now exposed along jungle tracks and ridgelines. This forced Japanese units to choose between risk and starvation, a choice that compounded desperation as the battle progressed. Morale followed the same downward curve. Soldiers spoke of nights that no longer ended, of light that came without warning. These accounts appear not as melodrama, but as matter-of-fact observations recorded in reports and interrogations. The enemy had learned to see them. That knowledge alone altered behavior. For Allied forces, illumination became a lesson rather than a doctrine. Commanders understood its limits. Overuse dulled its effect. Poor coordination invited counterfire. But when integrated carefully, light granted something rare in jungle warfare: initiative after sunset. By the end of the Pacific War, armored searchlights were not standard issue, nor did they dominate doctrine. Their significance lay elsewhere. It demonstrated that psychological dominance could be engineered, that battlefield conditions once considered immutable could be reshaped through adaptation. Japanese infantry remained disciplined, determined, and dangerous until the war's end. But one of their greatest advantages, night invisibility, had been compromised. When darkness ceased to belong exclusively to one side, the shape of combat changed permanently. That change carried meaning beyond Okinawa, beyond the Pacific, and beyond 1945. It spoke to a broader truth about warfare itself, one that only becomes clear when the fighting finally falls silent. War often teaches through contrast. Daylight reveals strategy, terrain, and strength. Darkness conceals them. For centuries, armies relied on night to hide weaknesses, to stage surprise, to give the smaller or lighter force a chance to balance the scales. In the Pacific, Japanese infantry had perfected that art. They moved unseen, struck decisively, and vanished before the enemy could respond. Night was their ally, their shield, their domain. The introduction of armored searchlights was not a flashy innovation. It was not a decisive weapon on its own, but it reshaped perception. Suddenly, the invisible became visible. Suddenly, the hunter became the hunted. For the men caught in those beams, fear was immediate and visceral. But for history, the lesson is larger. Technology and adaptation can bend fundamental battlefield assumptions. Darkness, once absolute, became negotiable. Tactics dependent on concealment became precarious. Initiative shifted not through overwhelming numbers alone, but through the strategic application of light. This moment reminds us that war is not static. Advantages, no matter how reliable, are only as strong as the enemy's ability to challenge them. It also reveals the human dimension. Courage, discipline, and fear exist alongside strategy, but perception shapes how they play out in the crucible of battle. By the end of the Pacific War, night had been contested in ways that had never been imagined. The psychological and tactical boundaries of darkness had been redrawn, leaving both sides to grapple with a truth as stark as the beams that cut through the jungle. In war, even night can be weaponized. And in that weaponization, the battlefield, and those who survived it, would never be the same again.